Scandinavia, the late 8th to 11th centuries. Oar and sail-driven longships voyaging across the Baltic and North Seas, raiding and pillaging, axes, bows, swords, shields, and horned helmets? What did the Vikings really wear on their heads? I'm Danny Ward, and this is Knowledgica. So, those horned helmets that we associate with the Vikings, they must have loved them, right? Turns out, archaeologists have never once recovered a horned Viking helmet. There is simply no evidence to back up that they ever even wore those helmets. That's not to say, however, that we haven't found any Viking helmets. We have. Back in 1943, in Hogsbyd, Ringerike, eastern Norway, during the World War II Nazi occupation, the only existing Viking helmet artifact was discovered on a farm and lacked any sort of horns. Only one helmet, you say? Surely there must be more. Unfortunately not. That's all we have. It has been suggested that this may be due to the fact that only high-ranking nobles would have owned and wore these helmets. This would have been during a time where iron was one of the dominant materials for battleware. Iron was difficult to make and cost a pretty penny too. In addition to this, iron is heavy. Putting a heavy iron helmet on your head when you're aiming for mobility and agility isn't exactly in your best interest, and so many Viking warriors simply may have chosen not to wear them and opted for lighter leather or fabric headwear instead. So what was the Viking head attire for, horned or not? To look fearsome in battle? Maybe. To shield against enemy attacks? Perhaps. Or maybe it was simply to offer protection against the harsh Scandinavian weather. There is evidence for all three, but we cannot be certain. It's most likely a combination of all three elements. So, these depictions of Vikings with their horned helmets must have come from somewhere. Well, actually, far from the Viking ages, the horned helmeted Scandinavian image actually originated in the 1800s. It is thought that 4 German epic music dramas by the name of Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung by Richard Wagner, was the first popular depiction of horned Viking helmets. These plays were loosely based on early Norse sagas about a dwarf named Oberich and his ring made from Rhine gold. Sounds kind of familiar, huh? From here, the notion that Vikings wore horned helmets grew ever since, appearing in cartoons, comics, sports teams, and more. We only have ourselves to blame. All that aside, that's not to say that horned helmets have not been popular throughout history. Far from it. We have plenty of historical evidence to show people from different regions around the world adopting horned helmets. These include Germanic soldiers, the Celts, Japanese samurai, Indo-Persian warriors, and tournament competing knights during the Middle Ages. Some wore these helmets for ceremonial reasons, others for intimidation during the battles, and a few military commanders even wore these helmets as a form of identification on the battlefield. Vikings, on the other hand, definitely no horns. The complete opposite, in fact. They would have had smooth, rounded iron or cloth headwear that were primarily built for function on the battlefield. It was actually the weapons that were used as a status symbol, not the fancy helmets. Evidence suggests that free men during the Viking ages were required to own and carry a weapon at all times. The more beautiful the finish on the weapon, the greater the wealth and status. Most armour would have been out of reach financially for the normal farmer or low-grade warrior, and so the attention was focused on having good quality weaponry. for the elite members of society, and for others who could afford it. This would have consisted of a spear, wooden shield, and a fine sword. Axes and traditional knives, known as seaxes, would have been carried by the average member of the community if they had enough money to spend. Otherwise, they most likely would have been limited to a simple spear and shield, with the possibility of a hunting bow. Evidence shows that the Vikings employed use of round wooden shields, mostly comprised of linden, fir, alder and poplar timbers, which would have offered durability and manoeuvrability on the battlefield. The rim was often reinforced with leather or iron. Some historians also suggest that it was the Vikings who favoured the kite shield, and were in fact the ones who led to its popularity spreading across Europe during the Middle Ages. However, once again with the Vikings, archaeological evidence remains limited to this day to support that claim. So, if there are no horned helmets, did they have long hair and beards at least? Worry no more. There are early depictions of Vikings revealing that many did indeed adopt the flowing locks and facial fluff. However, not quite as you may expect. With archaeological finds of Viking tweezers, combs and other grooming equipment, we can today bust another myth. The Vikings were actually quite well kept. Well, sort of. There is also evidence to suggest that other cultures thought of them as the filthiest creatures of God. But I imagine there would have been quite a high degree of bias there. Although, they did supposedly only wash once a week. This has been Knowledgica. Stay hungry for factuality.